President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed the Competition Amendment Bill into law. He believes it will bring much-needed change to the country. The law is expected to boost small and medium enterprises as well as create fresh investment and innovation. Joining me to discuss this, the law's impact on SMEs is Business Partners Limited MD Ben Bierman. He's with me in studio this morning. Ben, good morning and thank you for coming in.
Good morning, Timothy.
Having looked at the bill, do you think it will achieve the objectives?
I think the bill it represents a whole new, fresh way of thinking about how competition in an economy needs to be addressed in ensuring that SMEs and small businesses and broader ownership by itself is also stimulated and fair practices are actually being obtained. It's been a long time coming. We had the previous Competition Act, but to the extent that this does represent a bit of fresh thinking and innovative thinking, I think we're almost world leaders in the way that we think about influences within the broader economy that needs to be regulated.
And SMEs are very crucial, aren't they? Because over the last decade, we've heard, particularly in the State of the Nation address, about how that needs to be the key driver for job creation in this country. Why has it taken us so long then to finally get to a position where there's legislation that is actually ahead of the times or keeping up with the evolving business world?
I think we need to recognize that the priority of SMEs has always been recognized, and if you look at the National Development Plan, I think it's clear from the targets that have been set for 2030 that up to 90% of the new jobs being created in the economy must come from SMEs. The Act has been there, but I think this new amendment represents a fresh take on making things even better for SMEs in terms of looking very specifically at how bigger companies need to adopt, for instance, as an example, fair pricing when they deal with SMEs. So it's not as if there hasn't been anything, but I think this represents another step forward to try and create a more conducive environment for SMEs to compete fairly or to have a chance to compete fairly.
Has big business been deliberate in squeezing the SMEs out of opportunities?
I think I wouldn't say that deliberate, but I do think that there are known cases where big business has made it exceptionally difficult for SMEs. It's competition that's perhaps unfair in terms of how they price and how they try and prevent SMEs from getting a foothold within that specific sector. And that, I think, is an important distinction in terms of what the Act tries to do, or the amendment, because it does provide much wider-ranging powers to the Minister and to the Competition Commission in ensuring that where SMEs are competing, that they have a fair chance to actually get that foothold in the broader economy.
And let's talk about the Competition Commission, because in recent years it's done really well tackling everyone from bread cartels to construction cartels. They've also been invested in price fixing in the bicycle sector, for instance. But the criticism at the moment has been that the Competition Commission ultimately needs to get to a place where its reports end or result in prosecution, people facing jail time instead of the usual penalties. So with this amendment, is that where we're going?
I think the powers of the Competition Commission have been vastly improved in terms of this new amendment. So the penalties that they can exact or can impose upon players and how they deal with those, that has definitely been more formalized. So one can almost say that they've got much more teeth, and the interaction between them and the Minister and the Minister's powers in actually regulating competition and acting on those practices that are not conducive and not fair, that has definitely been improved. So I think we can expect. A word of caution, though, I think one needs to also look at what President Ramaphosa said in his State of the Nation address, where we want to improve our competitiveness as a country. And the one caution that one needs to raise around additional legislation is that sometimes that also, again, creates a layer of red tape and perhaps impacts negatively on the free market principles that will get the economic growth going. But all in all, I think in general, the gist of what they've proposed, I think will go a long way to improve the case for SMEs.
One of the other provisions in this amendment would be that for repeat offenders, for example, penalties by the competition authorities would be raised from 10 to 25%. But how impactful will that be, given that we've heard stories of big corporates who, in fact, when they go ahead with collusive agreements and other irregular business practices, budget for the penalties that are likely to come their way?
Yeah, I think that 10 to 25% of turnover, which is how the penalties are going to be regulated, they can be they can be devastating for big corporates. And I think another refinement within the Act that's also quite significant is that parent companies could also be held liable in terms of what their subsidiaries do and whether they actually knew or should have known what they were doing. So I think the extent to which the penalties can actually be very, very punitive, I think if they budget for it or they anticipate, one would then even... it's an interesting one that they would actually plan to break the law and then sort of make room for the fact that they're going to...
But it cannot be ruled out that provision would be made, especially if collusive behavior does not necessarily result in prosecution.
Yeah, I think the penalties itself is a big deterrent. To the extent that that has been increased, one could only hope that the companies would do what's fair and what's equitable in terms of how they go forward. I know that might be a bit naive to think that, but I think the minister itself and the sanctions that can be imposed, I think, would ultimately ensure that there's a better kind of corporate behavior.
The minister you speak of is the Trade and Industry Minister, who would also be empowered to take part in merger transactions and applications for exemptions. So how do we then take that empowerment of the minister's role in those big projects with multinational or international companies? How do we keep it within the realms of involvement that does not become interference?
Oh, that is the big challenge. I think in terms of what the ambits and the intentions of the law is, it's always good intentions, but the proof will lie in the execution thereof. So we will see to what extent it becomes interference. And again, you're touching on the issue that I raised earlier. That level of interference, it might again be a constraint to ensure that our economic growth is going. But one would hope that the intentions and the actions follow itself in terms of how the minister applies those increased powers.
Ben Beeman, I thank you for your time this morning.